Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. Let me start by saying that I am not an innovation specialist. I also have no skills whatsoever in the area of future insight type of work, other than the basics of strategy and strategic planning. However, I have been interested for years in the question why NGOs tend to be quite self critical when it comes to their ability to innovate and why they feel they need to get better at this. And what kind of organizational leadership do we need in order to get better at this? And then Dermot O'Gorman, the CEO of WWF Australia, introduced himself to me a couple of months ago. And we had this most interesting conversation about NGOs, strategic foresight work, and how to lead on innovation in an NGO context. So I invited him on the podcast. So welcome, Dermot.
Hi, nice to be here, Tosca.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us. So let me say something about we're going to do the podcast in two parts. The second and longest segment of the interview will be with what Dermot has learned on how to lead an NGO such as WWF through an innovation lens. But first, I'm going to ask him for some of the insights he gained with respect to three topics he examined in a recent sabbatical at Stanford University here in the US at the Digital Civil Society Lab. So first, for our listeners, Dermot was a visiting scholar, as I said, at Stanford University. He is the CEO of WWF Australia, as I said, where he has led several innovations. And he's also a board of director member for ACFID, which is the Australian Council for International Development, and many more things, but I'm going to leave it at that. So Dermot, let's turn to your sabbatical, which is now a few months ago that you came back from the US. What were your aims with this sabbatical, since the topic that you told me you hope to focus on are quite wide-ranging?
Yeah, it was indeed quite ranging, Tosca. And I think the power of a sabbatical, just to step back and be able to have some brain space to think about the world, was amazingly powerful, and the Stanford experience was amazing. But I went in there thinking about some of the big sort of mega trends the world was experiencing at the moment, and it's a bit of a cliche we're living in a disrupted world, and it's all very uncertain. So but over the course of my research, I really narrowed it down to three, and I use the word narrow very cautiously, narrowed down to three quite big areas of
Okay.
work. The first was really how digital disruption was hitting the not-for-profit sector for NGOs, and not so much about how to fundraise from digital fundraising or digital communications, but how it was really impacting the way that we deliver purpose.
Uh-huh.
The second area was this blurring of lines between profit and not-for-profit, the expansion of the philanthropy world into everything from impact investing to sort of venture philanthropy, and being able to match up sort of risk capital with the operational ability to deliver, risky, big, long-term, ambitious objectives. And then the last bit, which I've been a big fan of, the sort of fourth industrial revolution thinking, but that was really, what can we learn from history if we are living in the fourth industrial revolution? It's a period of radical transformation. It's not just a transition, it's a transformation. What does that mean for society, and what role does civil society play in that, and how does it get transformed, and how do business and government also get transformed in that process too?
Wow, that last topic is really big.
Yes, it
But
is.
so I'm gonna obviously have to make sure that our listeners get a little bit more of a feel for what you accomplished. And I believe that you have a plan to write up some of these observations, correct, in a paper that you may or may not want to publish. But if you do, we would love to attach that link up to that to our show notes.
Good. So, Tosca, I have published one around the fourth industrial revolution, and what I call, in fact, because the concept of an industrial revolution is a 1880s construct, looking at the first industrial revolution, and it's designed with a very linear mindset. You have a factory, you get some commodities, you put it through the factory, and you spit it out, you consume it, and then you throw it away. And that process was incredibly damaging to the environment over the last 200 or 300 years. And it also enormously impacted on workers. And so I think that the idea of an industrial revolution is the wrong mindset. I think it's more about a regenerative revolution. So I've written about that mindset and how we need to learn from the past of what a transformation looks like, because none of us have experienced in our lifetime.
Right.
And secondly, we get to design what the first regenerative revolution looks like. We're not at the winds of destiny of technology and these changes, and we are probably in a much better position than past industrial revolutions, where access to information, access to solutions were not there at the scale that we have as society around the world today.
Okay, so that paper, is that something that we can share through the show notes?
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
It's published about a month ago. Yep.
Right. And would it be fair to say that you've just kind of described what you took away from the Stanford experience for that topic?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, good. Then let me let's unpack a little bit these other two topics. So tech and nonprofits, digital and nonprofits, from a point of view of how can tech and digital deliver purpose better. And the second one is around this blurring of the lines between philanthropy and private and corporations in general. Tell us a little bit more what you walked away with.
Well, let me start with this blurring of lines between profit and not-for-profit. And this is not a new concept. It's been around for nearly a decade, But I think in the last 5, and particularly during the last 3, during COVID, we've seen this explosion in impact investing and in the rise of ESG, as it's called. And so and about companies starting to talk about the purpose of why they're there, and that some CEOs coming out and saying, well, actually maximizing return to shareholders perhaps is one of the things we do, along with delivering what society needs. And so I think that there's a rethink going on around the role of the private sector in delivering purpose, the role of business, the role of government in that, and therefore the role of NGOs and civil society. And so the bit that I was particularly interested in is within that world, there is lots of different types of capital sources, from pure philanthropy, and then there are so many different types of philanthropy, and there's a really important discussion about the effectiveness of philanthropy, and now you have the growth of different types of impact investing and ESG, and it's evolving very fast. The piece that I was particularly interested in is in solving some of these big long-term problems. Those individual sources of capital are good for various things, but often have limitations about how they can solve big long-term problems. This is over 10 to 20 years, where it's so much uncertainty that you're guaranteed to have failure at least 2 or 3 times over a decade or more. And so, but often in this discussion, failure is something that you don't want to do. So you can't say to a philanthropist, I'm going to do a 10-year project, I'm going to fail 3 times. you want to deliver some KPIs in 3 years. Or if you go to an impact investor, you've got to deliver the returns over a set period. Otherwise, the next round of capital is not there. And so bringing together various types of capital that can help get you through innovation sort of gaps where you're able to do that is important. But I think the other bit that I looked at was the flip side of that. You need to have the institutions that can deliver against those risk profiles. And many not-for-profits struggle, as you said at the beginning, with innovation and struggle with the risk profile of innovation because they don't want to be seen to be failure, or they're worried that their brand will be diminished because they weren't successful at everything they do. And so I think that matching society's risk capital with the NGOs of the future that can, on some big things, work through that risk profile, be innovative and co-design with partners, decade-long strategies that are innovative, agile, and are able to deal with failure at certain stages in the process is something I'm really interested in. And there's no one right answer to that. I think it's about how we work through that as a sector.
Okay, so you're really in that piece of work, you're identifying this gap, if you will, and maybe coming up with some perspective, the first thoughts about that, but really kind of flagging it sounds like. That sounds really interesting. And just for our listeners, because I want to make sure that everybody feels that they can track. So when Dermot uses the word ESG, he's referring to the G for governance, the E for environment, and the S for social. So the idea that corporations both need to think differently about their role in society and what they have to contribute, as Dermot said, but also have to be more cognizant of what the impact of their work is on social and environment, if you will. So that sounds really interesting. Well, whatever we can link to in the show notes will be welcome. So that sounds like it was a really big picture thinking. But now I want to pivot to managerially and leadership wise. What have you found as a senior leader in WWF Australia about what leaders need to do and be in order to spur innovation as optimally as possible? So I really want to keep it focused on these leadership behaviors and practices if we could. So give us a couple of examples first of what are some of what you think the major innovations that you've been able to lead on? And again, of course, it's not just you, it's your team and it's lots of people across the organization, but just give us a flavor of one or two innovations.
Yeah, well, look, I think that your last part of your question there is a really important part because innovation is around a culture, a mindset, and it's a skill set of your whole organization. And so, you can't employ a head of innovation and then tick a box and say we're an innovation organization. You can't just put an innovation fund in there and say, okay, we've got an innovation fund, we're innovation. So there is a whole suite of things you should be doing, including those two things, but that in itself doesn't make you an innovation organization. I do say to other CEOs after starting on this journey, sort of more formally about 7 years ago, your job as the CEO is to be the chief innovation officer. You cannot delegate down innovation and say, that's for somebody else in the business to do that innovative stuff. It's the whole organization's business is about being innovative. The second thing I've learned over the last sort of 6-7 years of testing and validating and, to be honest, failing a number of times in this process and sort of picking ourselves and dusting ourselves off and going it again is really that if you start with the understanding of what innovation is, it's a really good place to start because most people have a very different concept of what innovation is, and everybody generally thinks I'm an innovative person, which generally is true. But you, in building out an understanding about what innovation, you get a common language across the organization, and as sort of you're able to rally everybody around that common definition and its ability to deliver your mission. So that is probably another simple thing, your basic thing, but is often misunderstood at the beginning of an innovation journey for an organization. And then I think the last piece is, in terms of skill sets, investing in the skills needed for ideation, agility. There's a whole suite of the toolbox that you can use for innovation. But don't underestimate the importance of investing in the skills across the organization and the processes and systems to support that. Because having worked for not-for-profit for more than 20 years, we are set up to deliver projects, and we have great project cycle management processes and accountability processes through finance and safeguards and everything. They're super important, but managing a ideation skill set alongside a project management skill set is tricky, because there are different skills. And so knowing when to use innovation and ideation and when to then turn that into a project to be delivered is part of the culture of the organization that you need to build up over time.
I have heard sometimes that people say innovation processes need to sometimes be shielded, protected from the usual kind of bureaucratic processes and systems in order to have a fighting chance, if you say. Would you say there is something to that? And can you get a little bit more granular about these processes and systems that you say, if we don't get to that, then we can do all kinds of nice talk and ideation, but it won't matter?
No, look, it's a good question, because what's the saying? Strategy is a commodity and execution is an art. And I think that applies to innovation as well. Yeah. And so look, for example, about 6-7 years ago, we set up something called Panda Labs, which was our innovation sort of labs to help accelerate against sort of the purpose of WWF's mission. We, in the early days, looked at sort of sustainability in supply chains, because we'd spent 20 years working in that, or more as a network, nearly 30 years working in the sustainability of supply chains. We ran a series of validation sprints over the course of about 14 months with a suite of partners to come up with eventually a venture called OpenSC, which looks to verify sustainability claims, both human rights, environment, in supply chains like seafood, coffee, cocoa, palm oil. But that required not only to take staff out of the existing business, to run a sprint for 4 to 6 weeks, which is very difficult. You've got a project manager who's responsible for a project, to pull them out for 6 weeks upsets a whole suite of the business. And so you need to be able to, as you're suggesting, step in and say, hang on a second, I'm going to need that person. We'll manage for the downside of having them missing for a sprint for 6 weeks. And also the fact that later on, well, we're going to have to use some capital that if we didn't use it here, we would use it there. And other program managers across the business say, well, that's my capital from somewhere else that I'm now losing. So you're right, there is a process that keeps things moving, but there's also the flip side of a process to ensure that just because you're building something and you've invested a lot to date, that you don't just keep building it, because so the test and validate works both ways.
Also that means bringing things to an end.
That's right. So you need to
gates.
So you need to have an executive team who are not in the detail, but enough across key parts in there to help make those decisions as to test and fail, and a board that's willing to go on that journey as well, because these are significantly different things often to what the business is used to, and so the board needs to be across it and have a risk appetite for testing and validate. So the usual innovation processes are putting in guardrails at the beginning, putting stage gates so you manage risk in way are tools that organizations need to not only be comfortable with the narrative of, but comfortable what it means in practice to implement.
Interesting. Yeah. And that point about flexibility of funding. So having some reserves that you can put in on a time's notice, if you will. Well, that's probably the wrong English. But anyway, I think that you and listeners will know what I mean. But be able to put that to work when you see there's an opportunity to validate some more, that there is that flexibility, for instance, to do that. Yeah. Now, if you think about both, you talk with other CEOs, it sounds like, about how to shepherd innovation, how to be the chief innovation officer, as you say. If you think about some of the innovations that have failed in WWF, and again, we know it's a cliche, but failure has to be part of innovation in order to have a chance. Which of the reasons that you can think of for failure, for instance, in WWF Australia, for instance, or more broadly, the network, have to do with ways of working and mindsets? You used that word a moment ago, and culture, or are due to other kind of structural limitations that are inbuilt in the sector?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's very broad, so it covers a lot of sort of institutional sort of design and thinking, and also strategy. But maybe if I pick up on three elements in your question, the first piece, and you just mentioned it earlier, is that having capital that's fit for the purpose. So if you have, you know, it's time for the business, it's money, it's staff, it's staff capacity, it's the skill sets, making sure that you're matching the resources to the challenge you're trying to do. Because if you're trying to use a piece of money that must deliver this outcome in 12 months, and if you fail, you don't get your next tranche, it's not going to support an innovation process. So think carefully about how you mobilize the resources in the broader sense to do what the job is at hand. The second challenge, I think, for CEOs, particularly at the moment, which is why I like the concept of the fourth industrial revolution, is if it is a period of the fourth industrial revolution, if the transformation is more rapid and more disrupted than we've experienced over the last 30 years, and is more akin to some of the transformations that take place in the 1890s through to the 1930s, then the challenge is a lot more complex, because you can't say, well, as a leader, I've been doing this for 20 years, and so I know I've got a good sense of what the next 10 years looks like, and we can plot it out systematically, because there are so many disruptions that, when they collide together, fundamentally change the way that we're working. And I think that's a little scary as a leader, where you are unable to tell with absolute clarity where we're going as an organization.
Not knowable.
But I think it should, but your rest of your colleagues are also experiencing the same thing. And so if uncertainty, you either harden down and say, no, actually, I do know the answer, so I'm 100% right. You put yourself in a different position in 2 years' time if you got it wrong, which is going to be likely, because it's very hard to predict. And so the innovation process allows you to take the team on a journey to test and validate in much shorter sprints, to learn and adapt. And I think that in a period of great disruption, the innovation process helps you as a leader bring the team on the journey, where it's a little bit scary, if your income stream looks like it's going to disappear in the next 5 years because of some disruptive force that's coming across your business.
Understood. Yes. So that was the second one. And did you want to come with a third one, I believe, or am I wrong?
Yes. So look, I think the third piece is often in building out new parts to the business, you forget about the old parts. And so culture is a very difficult part to change. And so as you build out new processes and innovation, you have to also think very carefully about how you're removing some of the old processes, some of the old things that drive behavior back to the previous sort of
Love it.
form. And so removing things in organizations is always difficult. Yeah.
Yes.
Particularly if it's linked to purpose and identity
Yes.
of the organization or particular staff members. And so that is an important part of the change process, because you equally can't keep doing everything that you were doing. So we often like to, I'm going to be innovative, but I'm keeping all my old stuff and I'm building all this new innovative stuff, and the organization gets torn in different directions. And inevitably, the innovation stuff at some stage, everybody in the organization looks and goes, keep the stuff that I know, do this risky new innovation stuff, and the money is going, which way is the money going to go? And usually everyone goes for the safe bet, because the other opportunities is too unknown to take a big risk. And so avoiding getting to that stage is really important until you've built the skill sets to be able to make that judgment call with the board, the finance committee, the management, and the senior staff all involved.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting observation, because we know about culture change more broadly, not necessarily linked to innovation, but more broadly, is that if we do not reinforce the new wanted behaviors and habits, etc., in different systems than what we had before, that the draw, as you said, the tenacity of these existing organizational systems and processes is tremendous, right? And in the beginning, it's very attractive, as you said, to go back. And at the same time, if we are able to change certain reward systems and so on, then people, in other words, what gets celebrated shifts a little bit, then that very fact that people are prompted to behave and act slightly different than before leads them to also start thinking differently, right? So a lot of the time in the NGO sector, we think that if we change our thinking, it will lead to different action. But actually, what I've seen of the neuroscience on how people make decisions is the opposite. It's more that we act kind of subconsciously, and then we rationalize why we acted that way. And if we if we are prompted to act differently because of a change in system, we will also eventually start thinking differently. So I find that really interesting stuff, and what you just said made me think of that.
Yeah, and I look, I think this links back to the fourth industrial revolution, links back to how NGOs have been disrupted by technology. It links back to this blurring of lines between profit and profit, because all of those fundamentally could change what an NGO, what a not-for-profit, what a civil society organization's purpose, is, how it's going to deliver its purpose. And not in minor ways, in, history would say fairly significant ways. And that, I like to think about it in a mindset of abundance and a mindset of scarcity. And so, how, to your point, how people think when they are in a scarcity situation activates a whole lot of brain neurons, which is very different than when things are plentiful. And that's from our genetic upbringing, that, when there was lots of food, everybody was happy. When there wasn't, you had to really fight for resources. And so I think when we talk about scarcity as a civil society, when we frame the world up as being limited resources, you trigger in ourselves and in society an anxiety, and therefore we behave differently.
Yeah.
And we're living in a world where we've got more information, more financial resources, more connectivity than ever before. We're living in a world of abundance.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we live in a finite world in terms of natural resources. Yes, there's a suite of big social problems like growing inequity around the world, which if we don't address is going to fundamentally cause a enormous sort of shift in the whole world order. But if we, so that mindset is super important, because it's about how your brain sees a problem, and therefore how you react.
How we frame it, right? And we also know that human beings are we're much more focused on avoiding loss than on maximizing opportunity or possibilities. So this is takes a lot of self-awareness, both at the individual level, but also at the organizational level, probably. So I want to turn to a couple more. So I've interviewed some other innovation coaches. So not necessarily innovation leaders like yourself, but innovation coaches. And so they have told me a couple of things that they observe when they work with nonprofit clients versus private sector clients. So I want to run those by you and see if you have spotted any of those. Okay.
Yeah.
So one is these innovation coaches observe that nonprofit managers and leaders often are overly confident of their ability to project what's going to happen in general. That's one thing. Let me rattle off a few, and then you engage where you see there's some resonance with your experience. Another one is a difficulty as innovation managers and leaders, or those who make decisions on the next stage, for instance, on these stage gates, is staying focused on the desirability and the viability of an innovation, and not getting bogged down very quickly into, is it feasible and is it in compliance with our internal or external norms. And let me mention one more, and that is, and this is quite a well-known one here in the US that's often cited, is we fall too quickly in love with a solution instead of with the problem, staying with the problem longer. Do any of those by any chance resonate with your experience? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think there are three really insightful comments from, and look, I don't think of myself as an innovation leader. I said, I've led, I've been a CEO for 21 years in 3 WWF offices around the world. And I have a number of innovation coaches who give me advice on various parts of this, because it's such a complex area, and it's a different way of thinking. So I would encourage CEOs to lean into the network, to have mentors and coaches who can help them with some of these difficult questions. But if I do the second and the third insight is they're really around the ideation process.
Okay.
And so ideation is really an iterative process of small tests and validates. It really starts with unpacking and staying with that problem and not rushing to the toolbox, which is a very common issue with experts, because if you're an expert, your job is you've got your toolbox, you turn up, you take your tools out of your toolbox, you fix the problem. And so staying with the problem is a really important part of ideation. And then the second part is being able to stay in the uncomfortable world of, will this succeed or will it fail, and not sticking some of those institutional norms that you set in too early. And I think that's that's part of the role as senior manager and the CEO, to just keep an eye on that and be able to step in to help when things might get stuck, which they inevitably do. And that's just, I think that's just the norm of innovation, and so people need to be comfortable that these things are an iterative process and that different parts of the business need to be involved at different stages.
Yeah.
Because it's not about being unaccountable in innovation. That's the flip side. It's not about go away in a special room in the part of the building and just close the door and tell the rest of the organization go away. That's
Yeah.
not being innovative either. That's
No. Some
so
people think that way, right? That you have just a complete carte blanche, that there are no strategic boundaries around it, that it shouldn't be necessarily be attached to a strategy and so on. So yeah, I recognize what you're
there's
saying.
an innovation framework there. But look, the overconfidence one. Look, I think that um, that is not just, I think, a not-for-profit thing. I think that as you become more senior in your business, you've got more experience, and therefore you've seen a lot of this before. And so I think it's not the overconfidence piece. It's the piece that is your ability to, at some stage, say, I'm not 100% sure how this will work out, but I'm confident enough to go through a process and we'll see how we go and test and validate together. Yeah. It's where you at the beginning set out, well, I'm right, and this is how what's going to end at the end of it, that you set yourself up for failure and as a leader. And so I think that it's less about confidence and more about being confident in an innovation process that it can deliver the outcomes against your mission.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Okay, so as we need to bring this to a close, we haven't talked about organizational structure. Some
Yep.
people would argue that flatter organizations are in principle better at innovation than others. Do you have any kind of quick last comment on that?
No, look, I have experienced innovations in a number of organizations, both in the ones that I've led. I'm a chair of a social venture, which is much more entrepreneurial and flatter organization. I'm on a number of boards which are different, are very different. So I think if we loop back to the very beginning, Tosca, culture defines a lot of what you do. And I always think if NGOs are particularly good at this, but I think it's most organizations, is if you really go into a process where you're looking at your strategy, you're looking at everything, but in fact, you're really just focused on the structure of the business and moving the bits around in structure because that will solve the challenge that you're trying to do. It's a completely wrong mindset as a leader. And so I see too many organizations restructure it constantly because that will fix the problem.
Yeah.
When in fact, that's not the problem. It's a clarity of mission, and it's a culture that is able to be agile enough to go through the type of challenges, and it's the access to capital that will allow you to get through those sort of chasms of uncertainty that inevitably happen. That I think is far more important than being fixated on this structure is better than others. But of course, I'm not saying it's not important, but culture trumps that a lot.
Yeah. Makes total sense to me. Well, so we have to bring this to a close. So I always ask my guests if leaders and managers who want to encourage innovation in their nonprofits more than they currently do, where can they go to find you to get some informal advice?
Good. I'd love to hear from people. The easiest way is through my LinkedIn profile.
Okay.
So if you go to Dermot O'Gorman, as I said, I've published a couple of papers there. I will publish a couple of more over the coming months.
Okay.
But I'd love to hear from people about their innovation challenges. But I would encourage them to, look in your board and in your team. There are lots of innovators already there. Unleash their potentials. And then secondly, in your networks already, there are people who are doing this. So start with the resources that you have,
That you have.
because you'll be surprised that when you unleash those, how powerful they can be for innovation in your business.
Super. Okay, we will provide your LinkedIn profile and also, as I said before, your paper that you produced after the Stanford sabbatical period on the fourth revolution, or rather the first generative revolution, as you said, as you want to frame it. So thank you very much, Dermot, for your insights. And I just have found the couple of times that you and I have talked, I found them very, very enriching. And thank you, listeners, for listening in with us. If you found this episode stimulating, then just want you to know on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org, there are a couple of other episodes on the podcast, such as episode number 40 on the adoption of human-centered smart tech, number 38 on propositions for changes in roles and mandates of conservation NGOs, actually, and episode number 34 with Shervin Fikri of the Board of Innovation, which is an innovation coaching company, for instance. So there's a lot of resources there, a lot of content on offer, and we hope that you will check in next time with us again at NGO Soul and Strategy.